The relationship between the United States and Afghanistan is a multifaceted and evolving one, particularly shaped by decades of conflict and shifting political alliances. One of the most pivotal moments in this complex relationship was during the Soviet-Afghan War, which lasted from 1979 to 1989. This war, part of the larger Cold War struggle, saw the United States aligning itself with Afghan mujahideen fighters who were resisting the Soviet Union's invasion and occupation of Afghanistan. In its effort to counter Soviet influence in the region, the U.S. provided substantial support to these insurgent groups. This support came in the form of weapons, funding, and training, all aimed at weakening the Soviet hold on Afghanistan. The U.S. saw this as a critical front in its broader global strategy to contain communism and reduce Soviet power. However, the long-term effects of this U.S. involvement were far-reaching and not immediately clear at the time. Many of the individuals and groups that received U.S. aid during the Soviet-Afghan War would later play central roles in Afghanistan's political future. Notably, some fighters went on to form the Taliban, while others became part of al-Qaeda, organizations that would profoundly affect U.S. Afghan relations in the years to come. The withdrawal of Soviet forces in 1989 left a power vacuum in Afghanistan, leading to a period of civil war and instability. As the U.S. disengaged from the region after achieving its Cold War objectives, the country was left to grapple with the consequences of years of conflict and foreign intervention. This period of chaos ultimately contributed to the rise of the Taliban in the 1990s. The U.S. would later return to Afghanistan in the aftermath of the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks, this time as part of a broader war on terror. The roots of this renewed engagement, however, can be traced back to the alliances and actions during the Soviet-Afghan War, illustrating how the U.S.'s earlier involvement in Afghanistan set the stage for decades of continued conflict and engagement. After the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan and the country's communist government fell, Afghanistan plunged into a chaotic and violent civil war. Various factions vied for control of the country, leading to widespread instability and destruction. Amidst the turmoil, a group known as the Taliban rose to prominence in the mid-1990s, gaining control over large parts of the country. They promised to restore order but did so by establishing a strict and repressive interpretation of Islamic law. Once in power, the Taliban implemented harsh rules governing all aspects of Afghan life, severely restricting the rights of women, banning many forms of entertainment, and enforcing their laws through brutal punishments. During this period, the Taliban also provided refuge to Osama bin Laden and his terrorist organization, al-Qaeda. Bin Laden, who had previously been involved in the Afghan resistance against the Soviets, found sanctuary in the country as he plotted global terrorist operations. The presence of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan would have far-reaching consequences. On September 11, 2001, al-Qaeda launched coordinated attacks against the United States, hijacking planes and crashing them into the World Trade Center in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. These attacks were unprecedented in their scale and impact, leading to the deaths of nearly 3,000 people and shaking the United States to its core. In response to the September 11th attacks, the United States, under the administration of President George W. Bush, initiated a military campaign against Afghanistan. Dubbed Operation Enduring Freedom, this invasion began in October 2001. The primary goals were to dismantle al-Qaeda's operations, capture or kill Osama bin Laden, and topple the Taliban regime that had provided safe haven to terrorists. The U.S.-led invasion quickly drove the Taliban from power, though they would later regroup and continue to wage an insurgency. The removal of the Taliban marked a significant shift in Afghanistan's political landscape and profoundly altered U.S.-Afghanistan relations, with the country becoming a focal point of the global fight against terrorism. The war in Afghanistan, frequently called America's longest war, was marked by extensive military campaigns, nation-building initiatives, and counterterrorism operations. From the outset, the U.S. committed substantial resources to rebuilding Afghanistan's infrastructure, bolstering its security forces, and fostering governance. These efforts aimed to stabilize the country and prevent it from becoming a safe haven for terrorist groups like al-Qaeda, which had orchestrated the September 11th attacks. Despite the significant investments and strategic efforts, the conflict dragged on for years without a clear end in sight. The Taliban, who had been ousted from power in the early stages of the U.S. invasion, slowly regained strength. Over time, they re-established control over large portions of Afghanistan, particularly in rural areas. Their resilience posed a continuous challenge to the U.S. military and the Afghan government. A major obstacle to U.S. success in Afghanistan was the widespread corruption within the Afghan government. Billions of dollars in aid were funneled into the country, but mismanagement and corrupt practices hindered progress. The inability to build a stable, transparent government created disillusionment among the Afghan population, undermining efforts to secure lasting peace. Adding to the complexity of the war was the Taliban's use of guerrilla tactics. Their knowledge of the rugged Afghan terrain, combined with an understanding of local tribal dynamics, gave them an advantage. These tactics allowed the Taliban to launch effective attacks against U.S. and Afghan forces while remaining elusive, making a conventional military victory difficult to achieve. Ultimately, the war in Afghanistan highlighted the immense challenges of nation-building and counterinsurgency in a deeply divided and war-torn society. Despite the best efforts of the U.S. and its allies, the Taliban's persistence, combined with the internal weaknesses of the Afghan government, made it nearly impossible for the U.S. to secure a definitive victory. The relationship between the U.S. and Afghanistan experienced significant changes during the Obama administration, particularly with the troop surge in 2009. This surge aimed to intensify military operations in Afghanistan while balancing the desire to eventually withdraw U.S. forces from the region. The dual strategy reflected a complex attempt to stabilize the situation on the ground while preparing for a future transition away from military involvement. In February 2020, under the Trump administration, the U.S. and the Taliban signed a peace agreement. This agreement set the framework for the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Afghanistan, signaling a major shift in U.S. foreign policy toward the region. The deal was seen as a critical step towards ending America's longest war, though it was met with mixed reactions both domestically and internationally. When the Biden administration took office, it continued the policy of withdrawing U.S. forces from Afghanistan. This effort culminated in August 2021, when the last American troops left the country. The withdrawal marked the end of a two-decade-long military presence, but it also triggered unforeseen and dramatic consequences on the ground in Afghanistan. One of the most surprising developments was the rapid collapse of the Afghan government. Despite years of U.S. military support and training, the Afghan security forces quickly disintegrated in the face of the Taliban's advance. This swift return to power by the Taliban stunned not only the Afghan population but also the international community, which had hoped for a more stable transition. The final days of the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan were marked by chaos and uncertainty. The fall of Kabul, in particular, symbolized the sudden and tumultuous end to America's involvement in the country. This outcome raised serious questions about the effectiveness of the U.S. strategy in Afghanistan and left a lasting impact on global perceptions of U.S. foreign policy. Following the U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan, the relationship between the two nations has entered an uncertain and evolving phase. The abrupt end to America's military presence marked a significant shift in U.S.-Afghan relations, leaving many questions about the future direction of their engagement. While the military occupation has ended, the consequences of the two-decade war continue to shape their diplomatic interactions, particularly as the U.S. reassesses its role in the region. One of the most pressing issues in the aftermath of the U.S. withdrawal is the humanitarian crisis that has engulfed Afghanistan. The country faces economic collapse, food shortages, and a lack of basic services, all of which have worsened since the U.S. exit. The U.S. remains involved in providing humanitarian aid, though these efforts are complicated by the lack of formal relations with the Taliban, which now controls the country. In addition to the humanitarian situation, the U.S. continues to grapple with the fate of its Afghan allies. Many Afghans who worked alongside U.S. forces remain stranded in the country, living in fear of retribution from the Taliban. The evacuation of these individuals and their families remains a priority for the U.S., though the logistics of doing so are increasingly challenging under the current regime. Another area of concern for the U.S. is the resurgence of extremist groups in Afghanistan. With the Taliban back in power, there are fears that Afghanistan could once again become a haven for terrorist organizations, posing a threat to global security. The U.S. now relies on counterterrorism efforts that do not involve boots on the ground, using diplomatic and intelligence measures to prevent the rise of these groups. The legacy of the U.S. Afghan War remains a subject of ongoing debate. For many, It represents a costly and ultimately unsuccessful effort to reshape a nation, with long-term implications for both the U.S. and Afghanistan. As both nations navigate this new chapter in their relationship, the impact of the war will continue to influence their policies and perspectives for years to come.